Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio. Yeah. I know you're reciting it all along at home, along with me. Up next, so we talked about the downside of COVID-19 with Matt Harden and his suit against the governor. What about happy accidents, maybe? Things that might be good that come out of COVID-19 and the shutdowns and the school closures. Lindsey Burke is the director for the Center for Education Policy and Will Skillman Fellow in Education at the Heritage Foundation. Lindsey, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. I distinctly detect that your title is longer than it was the last time you were on the air with us.
That might be true, but I think that the length of a title is directly in disproportion to your impact. So I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
All right,
but thank you for having me back.
My title is host, so what is that? Never mind.
There you go, super powerful.
So Lindsey, because the schools all closed and we had to figure out what to do, the school districts tried to figure out what to do, but a lot of parents took the bull by the horns. I've made the case that perhaps even as little as 2 or 3 years ago, if COVID-19 had hit us then, it would have been even more devastating than it was because technology really wasn't where it is now even. Yeah. So give us some grasp as to the educational things that have been innovated since the COVID-19 shutdowns, which seems like, 5 years ago now.
Yeah. So you make a really good point. Had this happened a few years ago, it would have been a completely different story. I mean, we know that just from looking at the numbers of families who were homeschooling prior to the virus. So if you look prior to the virus, we had about 1.8 million families who were homeschooling, were choosing to homeschool, by the way. Choosing to homeschool is very different than what we currently have, which are accidental homeschoolers, families thrown into homeschooling, whether they wanted to do that or not. But we were at about 1.8 million families, so that's about 3% of the K-12 school-age population prior to the virus hitting. And that number has seen a tremendous increase since the year 2000. So about twice as many kids were homeschooling right before the virus hit as were in the year 2000. So it was growing in popularity. So had this virus struck a decade ago or 2 decades ago, there would not have been the familiarity, but there would not also, I think, have been access to the online content that has made it a little bit easier now. And it's certainly not easy. Families, many of them have said this is not the right fit for them, for their children, for their work-life balance, whatever it might be. But I do think your point is well taken, that we are better positioned today to meet the educational challenges that the virus has created than we would have been 2 decades ago.
Well, so many parents talk to me over the days and weeks in between and even beforehand about the failings of civics education, the failings of all these different things that perhaps they learned in school that they're feeling that their kids are failing to get at school. I really think that parents are now saying, oh, wow, this is something I really can have some control over, and it's not as daunting as the educators, the government educators had made us feel like it might be.
Yeah, and this is, you said sort of a happy accident maybe of the virus, is that families now do have the opportunity to really look at and internalize and digest what their children are learning in the traditional public school system. That's something that I do think is perhaps a downstream benefit to being at home, is that parents really do have the opportunity and should take the time to look at what their children are learning. And that could be, you mentioned civics or the lack thereof, right? We know, unfortunately, that civic knowledge is nowhere near where we would want it to be for Americans broadly. If you go out and survey your average American on the street, this is something the Annenberg Foundation did, and you ask them to name just one of the 3 branches of government, only 1/3 of Americans can do that. Only 1/3 can name a single branch of government. So that's a failing of the existing district system that we currently have in place. So understanding that, looking at things like the 1619 project that is permeating approximately 4,000 classrooms right now. That's something that parents should take the time to look at and to digest as well and to reassess. So there is that, as you said, sort of happy accident is that families do have the time and should take the time to do that.
Well, and you talk about the 1619 project. I went down. I did my radio shows, my local ones from the settlement, and it was great. But I tell you, they have played fast and loose with history. And then when called about it, they're like, "Oh, that was just an opinion column." And unfortunately, it goes into these collegial papers. But you're right, history itself has kind of fallen under play. Never mind things like vocabulary. Today's vocabulary word, kids,
Right.
autonomous. What does autonomous mean? It means we need people to bring us food and water. And no, that's not what autonomous means. But Lindsey, let's talk about the technology, because one of the dark sides of this is it's led to a lot of political figures saying, oh, good, this is a good reason to tell parents the government needs to bring them internet. Now, I know internet isn't your pigeon, but it is something that parents need to watch out for, quote, under the guise of well-meaning, government officials might be saying, this is, we will provide government internet for you so that you can do your online learning at home, and you still wind up with government education.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is not my area of expertise. I focus on the education policy side of this, but on the technology question, look, there's certainly an argument to be made that there are some students across the country that don't have access, whether it is the internet or the hardware or, what have you, particularly if we look at kids in rural areas. So there is a legitimate access question there. But the question is, what's the remedy? What should be the remedy? Should it be a government provided service, or should we look to the private sector, to philanthropy, to fill in those gaps? Of course, I err on the side of the private sector and philanthropy doing that, but
and it's going to do it better.
All of that aside, it does go to your question, your initial question about, what should parents be on the lookout? We are seeing the nature of education fundamentally change right before our eyes. The internet is going to be a part of that, right? I mean, this is a way in which we have access to more knowledge than we have had at any point in human history. And on balance, that is an incredibly good thing. But parents do need to be vigilant.
Right. They need to be the gatekeepers as to how that is coming to them. Lindsey Burke is on with us from the Heritage Foundation. They're director of the Center for Education Policy there, and you have recommendations online at heritage.org for reopening K-12. But you also you write a great piece about the teachers' unions, and I know so much of the news coverage lately has been police unions and what do they do to protect police officers that might be bad. But this has long been an issue with teachers' unions, where you have entire schools set aside in major metropolitan areas for just to house the teachers that they can't fire, but they don't want to let into classrooms anymore. When are we going to learn that FDR was right about these public sector unions?
Right. And, it's interesting because you see online now folks who have rightly called out the police unions as a problem, as a blocker to reform of, when reforms are needed, that it is those entrenched special interests that stand up and tend to prevent them from happening. Well, now it's time to turn that same critical eye to education, because the exact same problems exist. You have powerful special interest groups. You have the unions, the NEA, the AFT, who have billions in their war chest that they can spend to prevent the types of reforms that are needed, and that, by the way, the virus has demonstrated are so badly needed. That would be education choice, access to whatever, either school or educational environment might be a better fit for your child. That's something that the unions have long fought against. Differentiation of teacher pay, giving principals more autonomy when it comes to their personnel decisions. These are all reforms that are desperately needed in the public system, none of which is more important than ensuring families actually have access to the dollars that are spent on their child in the public system and can take them to learning options that are the right fit. So yes, it is time to turn a critical eye to the teachers union, perhaps, more than ever before.
Yeah, and they seem to want to insert themselves in this brave new world of educational access and saying, no, only if the teachers union says it's okay can you teach your kids online, and only if the teachers unions approve of the web content does it become something that. And I've watched people talk about, you won't qualify for some state test if you don't take it through the local teachers union approved web curriculum and things like that. Lindsey, the last one, and I wonder about this because I have college-age kids, and they are struggling a little bit with the online learning process. But I've talked to a lot of folks in K-12, and they think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Is it because the collegial environment for Wheel or Woe, whether it be Liberty or VCU, is more of a collaborative effort, so it becomes clunkier when you're doing it over an online platform in a chat room setting?
Yeah, and I think so much of what you're paying for, that large sticker price when you go to higher ed, is you are paying for that peer experience, right? So you are paying to live on campus, you're paying to join a sorority, whatever it might be, get that athletic experience in. And so much of what tuition captures is the bells and whistles component of higher education. So this actually has been somewhat of a clarifying moment for how we think about college financing too. Should we think about ways to reform financing so that we are paying for the education, the academic component of higher ed, and maybe leaving aside a little bit of that bells and whistles, all of the frills that have driven up the cost of college so much, the lazy rivers and climbing walls. And so it's another, I think, moment of reckoning for higher education as well. But regardless, online learning, it's not the right fit for everybody. For some people, it's a fantastic fit. And I would say that goes from anyone from kindergarten through grad school.
Lindsey, last one for you. What's your take on where we are this time next year, this time 5 years from now, regarding education, education access, and education portability?
Well, I'll say two quick things. One would be that I do think we will see a significant increase in the number of families who are homeschooling or schooling at home. I mentioned earlier we're at about 3% now. I think we could see that number double, which would be 6%. Still doesn't sound huge, but that would represent a pretty major shift for a lot of folks in how they access academic content. So that's sort of the positive. I am worried, though, right now about what is happening to our private school sector across the country. Families, so many of them are unable to pay tuition right now if a parent is out of a job. If we're talking about a religiously affiliated school, if the Catholic Church in the neighborhood hasn't been able to open and pass that collection plate, that could mean reduced revenue for that local Catholic school. Even school choice programs might see a hit this fall if that revenue is not available either. So private schools could see a real hit, and of course they don't have the luxury of receiving those public funds, regardless of whether they're open or not. And so that could be to the detriment, but I am broadly optimistic overall that what we are seeing, the silver lining, is a real reconceptualization of the delivery of education.
Well, thank you so much for spending your time with us this week, Lindsey Burke from the Heritage Foundation. You have an awesome Father's Day weekend, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Thank you for having me.
And don't forget that Virginia is home to so many of our founding fathers. If once you're done celebrating the father figures in your world and your kids' world, think about our founding fathers as well. And then we will see you back here. Maybe visit us online at virginiainstitute.org. Look up the podcast on our YouTube channel, Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Until next weekend, I'm Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.